Anastasios, so it gets recorded.
Okay.
So welcome, Anastasios. Welcome to our new venue here in Wimbledon. In 5.5 years in the cafe on the other side. Now we've become legal here. So,
Thanks.
so Anastasios has been involved with this program in different ways for many years, and is our external examiner here. And you're coming to talk about the death instinct and relational psychotherapy, something like that?
Yes. Actually, it changed slightly. I wrote something new. I wanted to share it with you. Forget about the death drive.
Oh.
It is about the death drive, but it's capitalism of the death drive.
We've just been rather topical subjects.
Right. Okay. So I thought I'm gonna share it with you. I read a book by a Korean philosopher called Byung-Chul Han, and he wrote about death and capitalism, and I was expanding on his ideas. So I thought I will share some of my thoughts with you based on some of what I read and my own sort of thinking on that. So the title of this, I mean, I will develop my ideas also a little bit as I speak. The title of the paper that I'm writing is called The Necropolitics of Capital, Expanding Hans' Analysis of Capitalism and the Death Drive. The Necropolitics.
Anastasios,
Yes.
can I just butt in very briefly? In addition to the named author that you've just given, in his essay, he also mentions Bernard Maris.
Yes.
Who wrote a whole book, but it's unavailable unless you pay an astronomical sum.
Yes.
Because it's in French, and I think there's one author that's translated some of his work.
Yes.
Anyway, leave it with you. I look forward to the talk.
All right. Well, it's good to know because I didn't know that actually he does mention him actually as a supplement to correct sort of Freud's conception of the death drive. You're right.
Excuse me, may I ask you to speak, because when you speak now there is the microphone, I hear better. When you turn, I can't hear very well. Would you mind changing the seat just so we can hear as well?
Shall I come here? Is it better?
Yeah. Yes.
Is it better? Closer.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. No problem. But you can see me though, right?
No.
Yeah.
Right.
Hello.
Hello, Anastasios.
All right. Here you go. Right. Okay. Now, in Byung-Chul Han's provocative analysis of contemporary capitalism relationship to death, we find a crucial intervention in ongoing debates about the psychological existential dimensions of capitalist society. While Hans' work draws productively on Freudian psychoanalysis, particularly the concept of the death drive, his arguments ultimately move beyond orthodox Freudian frameworks to articulate a novel theory of capitalism's paradoxical relationship to mortality. This essay seeks to expand Hans' analysis by examining several key theoretical tensions and unexplored implications in his work, while also putting his ideas in dialogue with other relevant theoretical perspectives. Hans' critical engagement with Freud's conception of the death drive represents not just a theoretical advance, but a fundamental reconceptualization of how we understand destructive impulses within capitalist society. While Freud's biological determinism posited the death drive as an inherent tendency of organic matter to return to an earlier inorganic state, this framework, Hans' framework, proves insufficient for understanding, Freud's framework proves insufficient for understanding the specifically human and historically contingent forms of destruction that characterize contemporary capitalism. Freud's attempt to ground the death drive biological necessity creates several theoretical problems that Hans' analysis highlights. The tendency of matter to reach entropy cannot explain the particular forms of calculated violence and self-destruction that characterize human societies. By universalizing the death drive, Freud's theory obfuscates and obscures the specific historical and social conditions that shape how destructive impulses manifest in different contexts and societies. Instead of viewing death drives as pre-existing biological impulses, we must understand how capitalism actively produces specific forms of destructive tendencies. This production operates through the commodification of basic survival needs, creating artificial scarcity and competition that intensify destructive impulses. The institutionalization of social Darwinism through market mechanisms further amplifies these tendencies, while the creation of what Mark Fisher called depressive hedonia generates a paradoxical inability to find pleasure except through consumption. Contemporary capitalism's relationship to time fundamentally reshapes how death drives operate. The system's demand for immediate returns and constant growth creates what a theorist called Jonathan Crary calls 24/7 capitalism, a temporal regime that denies natural cycles of rest and regeneration. So we are 24/7 on call. This temporal acceleration produces new forms of psychological and social destruction that cannot be reduced to biological impulses. The socially produced death drive manifests in various cultural phenomena, from the popularity of apocalyptic narratives in media and entertainment to the emergence of disaster capitalism, as described by Naomi Klein. The paradoxical relationship between capitalism and accumulation operates simultaneously at economic, psychological, and social levels, creating what Hahn calls undead life. This paradox manifests differently across different forms of capital accumulation, each reflecting distinct strategies of death denial, the denial of death. Financial capital, through its abstraction of value from material constraints, promises infinite growth through intrinsically complex forms of financial engineering. The creation of elaborate derivatives markets represents an attempt to hedge against uncertainty itself, while the role of debt creates future-oriented obligations that deny finitude. Human capital becomes another area where this paradox plays out, as individuals are compelled to engage in constant self-improvement and self-enhancement, and skill acquisition as a defense against becoming obsolete. Education transforms into an investment in future readiness, while human enhancement becomes medicalized as another form of capital accumulation. Even social relationships become subject to this logic, as social capital is increasingly quantified through digital metrics, and personal branding becomes a strategy for achieving a kind of symbolic immortality. The psychological dimensions of accumulation reveal deep connections between hoarding behaviors and death anxiety. Collecting becomes a form of symbolic immortality, while conspicuous consumption serves as a defense against the recognition of finitude. These individual psychological manifestations reflect broader systemic contradictions between the drive for infinite growth and the reality of finite resources, between capital accumulation and social reproduction, between private wealth and public poverty. This reveals a necropolitical death-like dimension. The necropolitical aspects of capitalism extend far beyond simple economic relations into the very fabric of life and death in the contemporary society. Drawing on Achille Mbembe's theoretical framework, we can understand how capitalist death-denying logic produces new forms of death in life that disproportionately affect marginalized populations. This necropolitical dimension operates through complex global systems that create what Rob Nixon calls slow violence, gradual and often invisible forms of destruction that disproportionately affect the global south. The spatial distribution of death, the distribution of space of death through space under capitalism reveals profound inequalities in how mortality is managed and distributed. The creation of sacrifice zones in the global south allows for the externalization of environmental and health risks, while capital flows shape mortality rates through their influence on healthcare access, environmental quality, and working conditions. This global necropolitics intersects with what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession, as communities are systematically deprived of their means of survival through processes of primitive accumulation that continue into the present. The embodied experience of necropolitics manifests through biological stratification, where class position and racial identity profoundly influence life expectancy. Environmental racism creates patterns of toxic exposure and health inequalities that Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes as organized abandonment. The privatization of healthcare access, combined with the role of pharmaceutical patents in restricting treatment, creates systems of medical apartheid, where the ability to survive becomes increasingly tied to economic status. Digital capitalism and virtual immortality. The digital transformation of capitalism has created new forms of death denial and virtual immortality that require careful theoretical examination. Digital afterlives have become increasingly significant as data persistence promises a form of technological immortality. Social media accounts outlive their users, while digital twins and avatars offer the illusion of continued presence after death. The development of posthumous chatbots and AI simulations suggests new forms of technological necromancy, where the dead are seemingly reanimated through algorithmic means. This digital necropolitics extends to memory technologies as human recollection becomes increasingly externalized to digital platforms. Cloud storage promises eternal preservation of personal data, while blockchain technology offers the illusion of immutable records that can survive individual mortality. The emergence of life logging technology suggests new forms of biographical immortality, where every moment can theoretically be preserved for posthumous recall. Silicon Valley's transhumanist ideologies represent perhaps the ultimate expression of capitalist death denial. The quest for technological immortality, whether through cryonics, life extension technologies, or dreams of consciousness uploading, reveals how digital capitalism's promise of immortality takes intrinsically literal forms. These technological solutions to mortality reflect what Catherine Malabou calls the new wounded, subjects whose relationship to death and finitude has been fundamentally altered by technological change. Now, this has also implications to the political economy of mental health. The relationship between capitalism and mental health reveals profound connections between economic structures and psychological suffering. Economic precarity serves as a fundamental source of anxiety and depression, as debt, job insecurity, and housing instability create conditions of permanent crisis that Mark Fisher termed capitalist realism. The destruction of community support networks through process of social atomization intensifies the psychological pressures, while the privatization of mental health care transforms suffering into another market opportunity. Therapeutic capitalism has emerged as a response to this crisis, with the mental health industry increasingly shaped by pharmaceutical interests and market logics. Therapy becomes a consumer service, while workplace wellness programs attempt to optimize worker productivity through psychological intervention. The rise of digital mental health platforms, which have accelerated since the pandemic, and meditation apps represents another frontier in the commodification of psychological well-being, as even mindfulness becomes subject to market metrics and optimization imperatives. In light of capitalism's complex relationship with death, resistance requires new forms of theoretical and practical engagement. Alternative economic forms, from solidarity economies to gift-based systems of exchange, suggest possibilities for organizing material life without a compulsive denial of death. Commons-based production offers models for collective ownership that might better accommodate finitude and limits. Cultural resistance to capitalist death denial can take multiple forms. The development of alternative temporalities through slow movement practices and Sabbath economies suggests ways of living that resist capitalism's frenetic pace. Death awareness practices create spaces for engagement with finitude outside of market logic. Green burial movements and alternative mourning practices challenge the commercialization of death while creating possibilities for more authentic relationships with mortality. The interconnected nature of this phenomena reveals how capitalism's relationship to death operates at multiple scales simultaneously, from global economic systems to intimate psychological experiences. Understanding this connection is crucial for developing effective forms of resistance and imagining alternatives to capitalist thanatopolitical regime. I've got also a section on art and artistic means of this, but I will skip that because it's getting a little bit too long. So I will go into the ecological implications. Capitalist terminal crisis. The ecological implications of capitalist death denial extend far beyond individual psychology into the very fabric of Earth's life support systems. Capitalist relationship to natural resources reflects its broader denial of death and finitude. The extraction of fossil fuels represents a literal mining of death, ancient organic matter transformed into energy, while refusing to acknowledge the deadly consequences of this process. The temporal compression involved in burning millions of years of stored solar energy in a few centuries perfectly exemplifies capitalist rejection of natural rhythms and limits. The concept of cheap nature, developed by Jason Moore, helps us understand how capitalist death denial requires an endless frontier of resources to exploit. This has led to increasingly desperate forms of extraction, life tracking, and tar sands mining, which represent attempts to deny the finitude of fossil fuel resources through technical means. The ongoing mass extinction event represents perhaps the most dramatic manifestation of capitalist thanatopolitical regime. The rate of species loss, estimated at 1,000 times the natural background rate, reflects a system that cannot acknowledge natural limits or the interdependence of living systems. This wholesale destruction of biodiversity represents what Elizabeth Colbert calls the sixth extinction. But unlike previous mass extinction events, this one is driven by specific economic systems' denial of ecological finitude. Finally, climate change can be understood as the return of the repressed death on a planetary scale. The accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere represents the material trace of capitalism's attempt to deny natural limits. The delayed effects of carbon emissions, what Rob Nixon calls slow violence, create a temporal gap between action and consequence that enables continued denial. The phenomenon of climate change denial itself reflects capitalism's broader inability to acknowledge death and limits. The fossil fuel industry's funding of climate skepticism represents an attempt to maintain what Eugene Thacker calls the world for us, a fantasy of nature as an endless resource for human exploitation in the face of mounting evidence of ecological collapse. Now, Hans' work points towards the need for what he calls a revolution of consciousness, that would transform our relationship to death. This would involve moving beyond both capitalist denial of death and traditional religious attempts to overcome it through promises of supernatural immortality. What might this new consciousness look like? Drawing on George Bataille's idea about eroticism and expenditure, we might imagine forms of collective life that neither fetishize nor deny death, but integrate it as an essential aspect of vital existence. This will require new economic and social arrangements that acknowledge limits while creating space for intensity and meaning beyond mere survival. Hans' analysis of capitalism and the death drive offers crucial insights for understanding a contemporary condition. By moving beyond both traditional Freudian frameworks and simplistic critiques of capitalism, he helps us grasp the complex ways that economic systems shape our relationship to mortality. Expanding his analysis allows us to better understand phenomena ranging from digital culture to ecological crisis, while also pointing towards possibilities for resistance and transformation. The task ahead involves imagining and creating forms of life that neither deny death nor submit to it, ways of living that acknowledge finitude while remaining open to vitality and possibility. This requires not just theoretical understanding, but practical experiments in building economic and social arrangements that support more authentic relations to both life and death. As we face multiple overlapping crises, ecological, political, and psychological, Hans' insights become increasingly relevant. The question is whether we can move beyond capitalism's paradoxical dance with death towards ways of living that embrace both the intensity of life and the reality of limits. This may be one of the crucial challenges of our time. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Anastasios. So, comments, questions, clarification?
I'm not sure. Have you seen this new Netflix show called Pantheon?
No.
It's about uploaded consciousness and like in one death and the capitalist element of that. And you think
All right.
it's really interesting. It's an anime, it's cartoon, but it's
Okay.
really
Pantheon, okay. Keep that in mind.
And you talk about kind of finding alternative modes of economic expression which would allow for our limits, or for the limits to be less, let's say, detrimental. What could that kind of look like? What would that be in any kind of shape or form? Do you have any kind of inclination or idea as to what that might be? Or is it just kind of very open-ended and something that we have to look into to find out?
I think by necessity it's open-ended because we can't necessarily have a positive, a kind of complete program of how this will look like, although people attempt to offer different alternatives, like how different collectives and communities can work, based on, we can work the land, or can work can exploit, can work with the earth and work the land and work the technology that we have, but use it in order not to lead to this endless accumulation and infinite growth, which is what the capitalism is a way is aiming constantly, not acknowledging limits and pushing always against it, but actually respecting that there is a certain sort of way of doing things, that we need to actually to have boundaries and restrictions in our own sort of desire for growth and accumulation, and I think this should be in a way a transformation of consciousness, because otherwise the results are disastrous, and we see the results as they happen, right? The alternative of that infinite growth, no limits, no denial of death, denial of limits, denial of boundaries, is becoming extremely destructive and leads to what Han calls a kind of an undead life, which, although we deny that, death pulls everything in a way through the back door. It comes back in a way, is the return of the repressed. You know, you repress it, you deny it, but then it comes back and destroys everything, right? So the alternative to that is, you know, anything bad, infinite growth, anything bad, rejection of limits, anything bad, you know, will be a much better alternative.
Is it dangerous that whatever you do will be engulfed by capital, because that's its nature?
Yeah.
Nature is
Sorry.
to
Can I just interrupt for a second? We've got a couple of people who are struggling to hear a little bit.
Ah,
So they don't know what the ideal solution might be, but
Scottish louder.
yeah,
Run up there and
you're breaking that to speak.
is the questions, not me, but the questions, right?
Could someone, would anyone mind saying, is it the questions that you're struggling to hear, or is it everything? Or
It's just the questions, I think.
question? I don't think I mean, maybe Anastasios could like repeat the question back when you've done question.
Okay.
Or Dal.
Oh,
Yeah.
long rambling questions.
See how.
Okay.
Well, you can speak into the iPhone. If you've got a question, I can hang this to something.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah.
It's literally question time.
Yeah.
Continue my question.
Hello.
I want to continue my question. I thought you said no. Go. Oh, I don't want to hold that. I want to sit next to Anastasios. Oh, do that then. Sorry. I'm going to come on. I didn't know.
Yeah, come and sit next to me. Okay. Yeah.
Can people hear?
Yes, now.
Good.
Right. Okay. So I was sorry. I was in the middle of a long rambling question. I can't possibly remember what it was about, but it was something about whatever we do. Is it not the risk that capitalism, because of its very nature, will incorporate it?
Yeah.
And so that, you know, because capitalism, although, you know, you're talking about the death instinct, the death drive and you know, libidinal energy go hand in hand, don't they? And there's something about capitalism that is incredibly libidinal and incredibly energetic and creative, and reproduces itself all the time. And so I worry that whatever we do will simply be incorporated into capitalism. And I don't know how we avoid doing that, you know, because it's life in death, but it's also death in life.
Yes. Well, I think.
Is there anything outside capitalism at the moment?
Well, I mean, that's, you know, one of the failures that we face is the failure of imagination, right?
Right.
How can we imagine, and that's where capitalism has won the battle. We can imagine the end of the world, but we can't imagine a life without capitalism.
Yes.
You know, so in many ways, so there is a sense that already we are, you know, that's the battle of the imagination. You know, it has been lost of what we can imagine outside capitalism. But let's start of you know, things that we already have, that already provide, and that's where, you know, some examples of economies that are not based necessarily. But the problem is even green economies or green initiatives already been taken on by corporations, and they are advertised as part of their own project. You see, so the resistance to capital ends up being, you know,
exactly
being part of it. And one of the attempts that perhaps one of the things that capital cannot incorporate, it's unfortunately, fortunately, is the fact that to break down this type of illusion of individuality, you know, that somehow if we are to promote a sense of death in life as something that, you know, breaks, it's not simply about, you know, mortality and finitude, but also a sense of breaking this type of individual illusion, the individual of the individual self-enhancement and self-aggrandizement, but as a kind of continuity that is established in, like Bataille calls, in erotic connection, right? then you have a different type of connection that is not based necessarily on individual growth and accumulation and enhancement and skills, but something that actually restricts itself in order to incorporate the other without eliminating the other, of course, right? It's very difficult to imagine anything that will provide the resistance without being absorbed by capitalism. But however, one thing that the capitalist cannot do without its own mythology. And that mythology is based on this, the individual producer, the kind of individual entrepreneur, the notion of self, and the boundary itself that somehow becomes the entrepreneur that sells itself in the market, right? And how do you break down this sort of fantasy, which is a fantasy, because for every sort of mythology of individual existence, we can counterpose the end of the individual in many ways, right? There isn't the individual in capitalism is not really an individual.
No.
Yeah, but on another level, this is the whole, the whole sort of mythology that is being sold and propagated.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
If I'm interrupting you, look, I'm sorry I'm not there tonight. I'm not well, but I lots of really interesting things. You see, but I'm sort of with you, I think, on most of the things. But what I'm worried about is whether or not the very idea of preserving something called the death drive plays into something which is much more individualistic. That it actually is too much to capitalists. People want to sort of say, oh, I don't know, there are things like you can't stop progress, and humans are naturally selfish. I mean, there's something about that, the notion of a drive, especially something that maybe I'm too close to thinking too much of Freud, that tends to be located in individuals.
Yeah. Individual organisms that relate to some type of entropy and self-destruction or aggressivity. Yeah.
I don't know how much it's located in individuals, or how much there is something in what, I mean, especially in what you're saying about it's like a refusal to acknowledge limits. It's like just believing in limits in a way. So I'm just saying, I'm just thinking, why not let the death drive die? Put it that way.
But that's what Han is in a way advocating, that the death drive should move. Is creating that type of individualistic. It is derived from this type of individualistic insistence of capitalism on accumulation, of constant infinite growth and accumulation. So in that sense, his existence is somehow reinforced and continues because of that, right? So,
okay.
And in many ways, the death drive is the denial of death. You see, the death drive as such, the denial of limits and the denial of death. That's what Han is saying. Actually, he's not differing from what you say, right? It's the denial of death, that the death is almost, the denial of limits, the denial that somehow, we can overcome this drive and we direct it into infinite growth. So, we can turn it into this sort of this machinic logic of infinite growth.
Yes,
right?
Yes. Okay, that makes more sense to me. I mean, and Freud's initial idea of the death drive, there's something about that which it's a bit like even now a death is something inside us. It's something that comes inside us. It's like it's just too much control and too much.
Exactly. Too much control, too much something that it becomes an individual property. And in many ways, then can be controlled and overcome with technology. That's what capitalism advocates, right?
Yes.
We can control it, we can overcome it, instead of acknowledge as a limit that it doesn't belong to us. It's the limit that is imposed by the other, or by nature, by limits that are not, they are not within our control. And we need to respect it and actually include it into our own sort of ways of living.
Right.
And is a denial of mortality, and the death drive plays into this type of capitalist accumulation and capitalist, infinite growth production, and consumption as well, because this is the other thing, right? That somehow we can endlessly produce and endlessly, and that's the crucial thing. Endlessly produce and endlessly consume without limits. And the limit is death, the fact of death. The limit is mortality, is finitude. But the denial of limit is this death drive, overcoming it, going beyond it, and controlling it, and moving, which of course creates a death wish that finds applications in creating a life which is death-like. The denial of death creates a life that is death-like. And the idea that we can constantly work 24/7 and we perform and we do all of this, we become performance zombies, right? The living dead or the undead living, right? So in that sense, this constant performance, this performance zombie, like, is a denial of limitation, that we can carry on sort of living, or if Earth, sort of, the resources in Earth are limits here, well, let's go to another planet.
Yes, that's the idea.
But excuse me, can I say, because this sounds a little bit similar with the concept or archetype of immortality and freedom, which you find in yoga, in the yoga sort of, in Eastern, it's not even Freud, it's beyond that, before that.
Mm. The idea that we can be, but that's also the problem, it's another.
So that comes from the East, it's from the Indian, from the.
Yes, but
Mircea Eliade speaks about it. I read about that in Eliade,
You're right, but the problem is that capitalism itself is a form of, is the contemporary form of religion, right? It's another form of religion.
Yeah. So, but it's almost like a modern view of this immortality and freedom, which the yoga, it's trying to,
Spiritual sort of immortality is more a material one, right? Capitalism is, if we accumulate enough wealth and enough sort of resources and enough, private wealth, then we can escape death, right?
But it appeals to the psyche, because these concepts are very old. I mean, they're not new. What you say about the capitalism, it's maybe like a manifestation of it, but if it's not this, it's going to be another. That's what I'm trying to argue. It's not just.
I agree, but I don't believe this idea of archetypes. Personally, I think there is a kind of social creation of this. Including the religious sort of manifestations. So, but perhaps there is something about moving beyond this sort of metaphysical transcendence and actually accepting the limitations of our earthly existence, right? There is something about capitalism as a new form of materialist religion that, in a way, cancels all previous religions and supersedes them, but takes away all of these spiritual elements and transforms it into some type of material realities. And that's what is happening,
In the philosophy.
What about the young? The young feel that, well, they're not going to have enough money to buy anything. Their realization that capitalism and the world's coming to an end in nature, maybe there's hope for them that, they see that they don't necessarily want capitalism.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, I think that's what a few young people, this idea of some sort of legacy. Resources to a different development, technological needs. They just die looking at their phones.
I'm sorry, I'm finding it very difficult to hear. I'm not sure if I'm the only one online, but I think we probably all find it quite hard to hear.
Okay, so there's something about our young people a hope, or our young people just dying on their phones on social media instead.
Hello.
Yeah, I was just thinking what you said, denial of boundaries. It reminded me of maybe denial of
the lack
Mm,
in Lacanian type
Mm,
of lack,
mm,
and the constant trying to
mhm,
cover the lack through consuming,
mm,
and how capitalism exploits that lack.
yeah.
And that death drive is therefore the drive, as in the agency that each one of us have
Mm.
towards death, because we're going there anyway.
Yes.
So it's that kind of agency that
Mm,
is fueled by
mm.
this through consuming as well.
Through consuming. Okay. Yeah.
you know.
No. I get what you're saying, but I think for me there is, there is definitely about, the nature of there is something about the nature of desire and the Lacanian nature of desire and lack that actually capitalism has used not to see the limits of desire, but actually always think that desire is always wanting more,
Yeah.
right? That can never be satisfied. There is always more, and the lack is striped in the structure, so we want more and more. So where do we actually reach the limit of that desire? There is no limit to desire. Death is the only limit to desire.
That's why you go in
Yeah.
there. It's the
Yeah.
drive to death.
Yes, it's the only limit of desire is death. But what capitalists cleverly did say, well, you can overcome this even if you accumulate enough means to do that,
Yes.
then you don't need to stop desiring. You can desire after that. You can achieve immortality. So that the old sort of incentive of religion has translated into material incentive, that immortality can be achieved
Yes.
now through capitalist accumulation
That makes
and not through so your desire doesn't need to stop with that. It can continue. And you continue desiring for more. And that more is union with the divine, in the religion, right? The desire, that's what Christian religion always said. We have this desire because we want to reach the divine,
Yeah.
right? On some level, the eternal, the immortality. So in that sense, if you take away all of this and make it about material wealth and, limitless production and consumption, then you unite, you achieve your yeah. Yes, you become divine yourself.
Yes.
You don't need God to desire God anymore. You become God yourself. You're the divine.
Doesn't psychotherapy more part of the problem than solution? Isn't not only this focus on the individual, the individual stuff that comes there, but when you say religion, there's sort of two problems. There's way philosophy is seen. So you've got Hegel, maybe was the only person who introduced the kind of social forces through Kojève's lectures, to people like Lacan. But there's that notion of progress where, as you've written points out, suggests that that incorporation of the dialectic will always lead to progress and just a few blips rather than continuous. And so isn't the problem that to start with the psychological will always leave society fucked? In a sense, it's that it didn't sort of Lacan, start off with being the whole stuff was presented by Marxists. The whole his whole seminars were on that.
With Althusser and all the Marxists, right?
Exactly, with Althusser. But what's the big problem for us and Lacan was he then got interested in Heidegger, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So if you start with the psychological, well, you never really get to the social.
Yeah.
Have we not all got to start somewhere else and not on the psychological? So not psychotherapy, not even psychosocial, but maybe socio-psycho.
Yeah. I mean, the kind of perhaps there is something about this, the over-emphasis on the psychological and kind of having a kind of psychological centuries, focusing on the individual and focusing on the individual psychology. That perhaps is also part of the problem, right? as you said. And there is this sense of, so perhaps also in another way, the work of Georges Bataille becomes interesting, because in him, you know, in the moments of, you know, having death as part of an erotic experience, you know, it's the dissolution of individual boundaries and uniting. Petit mort, exactly. The little death, the dissolution of individual boundaries, and where, you know, there is a meeting of the other, where there is a continuity of existence instead of individual psyches, you know, looking after their own private interests. So there is something about expenditure, about a different type of economy that moves beyond individual interest and accumulation into a kind of losing yourself in the other, and the other, in a way, is bringing life to the point of death, in a way, and acknowledging these limitations, where the other is instituted as another reality, which you have to actually incorporate in your life, but without denying its otherness, you know? So, you know, really, another without his or her otherness is just an object of consumption. If you deny the otherness of the other, he says ready as an object of consumption. And that's exactly what we do constantly with everything that we consume.
Can I ask a question on that note? I was just wondering, maybe I'm hearing it at a slightly different angle, but if one of the things you were saying is that sort of capitalism, if you like, is offering an illusion of immortality, and let's say that illusion is starting to fade or to slip, especially with maybe a younger generation who aren't getting those immediate rewards from capitalism, isn't maybe working for them. Do you make a connection at all with maybe the appeal, which I'm sure we would find sort of upside down, the appeal of fascism or totalitarianism, which might seem completely nonsensical to us as a group, but nevertheless, given what you're talking about, represents in some ways a solution to the same problem?
Yes, but because they achieve, there is another sort of, another illusion, which is, you know, will bypass all the problems of exclusion by, you know, transporting them, displacing them into a specific group, right? Migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, whatever, you know, people who coming and taking away what belongs to us. Otherwise, we would have had plenty of this. And we, you know, another illusion. We plenty of these, and we'll give. So the problem really is these people that come and take it from us.
Yeah.
So, you know, the solution, and then, you know, how we can make ourselves great again. How we will find a place. We reinforce our boundaries, our borders, and, you know, make ourselves great again.
Yeah.
So as to resume back what is lost. But what is lost fundamentally is that the desire, you know, there is, you know, the more that the concentration of capital becomes the property of a few plutocrats, you know, and a few oligarchs, and you know, and a techno-feudalism, as you know, my Varoufakis, Greek Varoufakis saying, you know, then the outcome is that less and less people will actually, the wealth will be distributed to others. And there is no way that can be reversed at the current state without the limitations of this, you know, accumulation of wealth to a few hands, you know, and how this is possible. This is, but then what totalitarianism promises is that, you know, well, that's not a problem. The problem is these others, you know, and take away our resources. Not the fact that, you know, the accumulation and the distribution of wealth is very specifically sort of designed to serve very few people only. You know, the 1%, not even the 1% anymore.
Yeah.
So
thank you. Yeah.
No, but it is, you know, is a solution, but in a way they work in tandem with one another. They, you know, totalitarian solution is another way of continuing, you know, the function of capitalism, including, you know, the solution that fascists provided, Hitler provided. It was serving, you know, German capitalists quite well. They actually supported him during the war in his election, right? So it's happening now as well. You know,
I agree.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I mean, the thing about capitalism is it's always
Speak to the thing. Speak to the thing.
Yeah, I was just going to say the problem. I was going to say one of the problems. Well, one of the things about capitalism is that it's got to have people to sell to. So if eventually capitalism impoverishes everyone apart from 1% or less than 1%,
Yeah.
it runs into it seems to me that that's the only hope, is that we all get so poor we can't buy anything anymore, because capitalism is about buying.
Yes.
And if you impoverish everybody, you've lost your punters.
Yeah.
So is it, is that, I wonder how capitalism, which is so endlessly creative and manages to pull itself back from the brink of destruction all the time, I wonder how it will manage when it's reduced everybody apart from a tiny percentage to an inability to buy anything.
Well, we'll always try to, to turn, to find divisions within that 99% where we'll turn one part of the population against the other.
But they won't be able to buy anything. They might be able to hit each other over the head, but that's not capitalism.
I think
about continual selling, isn't it?
But they will be sustained at the moment, there will be precarity, and there will be enough just to get on, right? Like it's happening, just enough to get on. But then, the loss of life and the loss of healthcare and then death will become more common. In a way, we're going back to the Middle Ages, right?
Feudalism, exactly.
It's feudalism. How feudalism preserved
That's right.
itself.
Yes.
It wasn't capitalism.
Or
Feudalism
slave
preserved.
society.
Yes, slave society.
You didn't have to sell anything to them because they had no power. You could just make them work.
Exactly.
So
feudalism.
I think also there is something, isn't there, about doesn't capitalism mean, when I'm thinking about I don't know, things like unemployment benefit and all that sort of stuff, it's a way of making sure that people have a bit of money to spend on a bit of things. Maybe it's a way of keeping that going. And there's fantasies about there's always new markets to be discovered or exploited or created.
But that's infinite growth, right?
We can have endless growth. It can just go on forever and ever.
Yeah, that's the truth. That's the fantasy. And in many ways now is expanded with new technologies, and now going to other planets and exploiting the resources there, investing in Mars or
you've got to have people to sell to.
Yes.
Speaking of, I think there's something, isn't there, about how that we're rolling out the drugs to pharmaceutical drugs with mental health drugs, whatever they call them, to all sorts of places on the. This is a nice market, isn't it? The places in China, Africa, etc. We're selling them things to help other people with mental health. It's finding another market, isn't it, or expanding the one that's already there.
Absolutely. Look at the current, ADHD and autism epidemic, right? The amount of amphetamines that have been sold, the last is about 300% more than we saw the last 40 years. It's like, and how come, every other patient that or client arrives, oh, I've got ADHD, right? I mean, how many times I've heard it the last year from patients, oh, maybe I've got ADHD, And of course, they don't need, even if they go to a psychiatrist, they just give them handing away like candies, And of course, they self-diagnose themselves on the internet, and they find there. So here you go, another sort of thing to sell,
I think the way I understand it, it's not necessarily, capitalism isn't so much about selling resources, it's about controlling the resources that are available. And actually, when we think about what the next 50 years will hold, I think things like clean air, clean water, and land that isn't too hot to live on are just going to become scarcer and scarcer. So I don't think scarcity is going to be in short supply. I think the fight over those resources is probably likely to intensify.
Yep,
Unfortunately.
I agree. And also controlling, from a Marxist perspective, is also controlling the means of production and the resources. So in that sense, controlling the technology, controlling the platforms that things are happening, controlling the land, controlling the water, controlling the supplies that, we need in order to sustain life. In that sense, we'll always need to pay our dues and our rent to the people who control that, and they give us access to. So, hopefully they will give us enough money to be able to pay this, just about to be able to live. Hopefully we won't be able to settle for that. Sorry, Tris, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was thinking about the idea of entropy, and I was thinking that maybe it's less of resistance and more of a forward motion. And I think something you're saying is that we tend to purchase the thing in front of us as opposed to create. And what would happen if we stopped being consumers and became creators? So rather than resistance, because entropy only goes in one direction. Once the genie's out, it's out. And technology is allowing us all at different rates to access, causing the scarcity and this fear of scarcity. And I just wonder if what you're talking about is this engagement with how do we stop purchasing the thing and start creating it within us and part of us. That's a forward motion, not a resistance. So how do we move with it rather than
against it? Yeah,
pull back? That was my only thing.
Yeah,
Because in resistance, really the question is who would resist?
yes,
The people who have nothing resist.
Yes,
But the people who have and have the technology to propel forward. And so you've got this real discrepancy. What if we didn't resist? What if we created rather than bought the answer?
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective. I think I like the idea. In many ways, I think that's a way forward in terms of some of the artists that I wrote about and I admire, the sense of creating things that are transient, and in a way acknowledging the limits of the creation instead of trying to create something that will outlast and will always will promise this type of immortality. In that sense, going with the flow of entropy instead of resisting it, and transience in a way. I remember. I think. The idea, for example, of creating these works of art that will eventually succumb to the forces of nature and they will disappear with time, instead of promising that type of denial of death and outliving, like the social media profiles or data banks or servers or or clouds, iClouds that will outlive the user. Yeah,
I think this is what we were saying earlier. What have you created with your neighbor? What have you created with your family? What creation's not just a technology. This is creation, this group. You know that. What if we start with here, right here? What can we?
Yes,
together.
I think people will eventually, do, and they're already doing it. And there are sort of, the kind of what I said, slow economies and Sabbath economies that they don't focus on acceleration but focus on taking your time to create something, right, instead of actually speed and efficiency and fastness and the kind of management speak that we hear constantly, and and resting and not having 24/7 sort of economy, but the economy that acknowledges the importance of breaks, of Sabbath, of something that, and of course we're going to the opposite direction because if you go, for example, in China, Korea, the Southeast, they don't have holidays, they don't have breaks, they work, and in a way, our economies they're proving in the West inefficient because we have too many breaks, too many holidays, too many, right? Too many things, and we don't work endlessly. And this is we provide proving inefficiency according to this market model. So what we went the opposite direction. What we have the choice, that there was something that will expand us, and we didn't choose it, right? That what if we have the same that says, well, here's an opportunity for you to take this and expand and make more money, and we didn't, What would happen then? Even in our own lives, thinking maybe I could, if you can invest on that or expand this, and what if we actually say, well, no, I'm okay.
Why not?
Why not?
The possibility of people saying, well, why not just a distribution of wealth?
Yes.
You were talking about feudal.
Yeah.
I'm usually in the West Country, in the West Country, and this vast land, all owned by somebody who supported Henry VII in 1485.
Yes.
Yeah. Just enormous. And there were all these little cottages with loads of other people.
Yes.
And yet the manor house wasn't fortified. There wasn't an army.
Yes.
And and yet it seems that we don't have a redistribution of wealth. We have this problem that those of us here who own property have done rather well in the last few years to the detriment of everyone else, but we're not offering to pay capital gains tax on our houses, which would be a start. So I suppose there's this sort of thing about what's not being mentioned. It seems like when they do opinion polls, people don't want inheritance tax. They want the chance of the dream of
yes,
passing it on and what
have
you.
Yes.
But there are these other possibilities of radical changes in the taxation system, for example. Why do we put up with just a few people owning most of the wealth?
Because we become complicit. They make us complicit.
Think tanks work on how to.
Governments want to pay so much money to the government, don't they? That's why super rich, because they don't.
It's only the poorer people pay tax, but also the system that's controlled and controls us. And all the think tanks that working night and day to work out ways of doing things.
Look, it's so difficult to be angry and to find an enemy in a position when you're part of that problem as well. And making you part of it, making the illusion that you're also part of the problem. Look, I mean, I was watching the wildfires in Greece that happen now more and more often, and half of Greece is getting burned every summer, and then floods, of course, in the winter and autumn and winter, which of course there will be consequence of not having trees to keep the water. So it's happening, and it's happening more and more, and of course the whole landscape accelerating
because of Trump, and because the whole financial world has gone out of even pretending to have that.
So I watched this, and then I went to drive my car. Right?
Yes.
That's why I find these talks quite difficult.
Do you want to come over?
I think that's why I find these talks quite difficult, because we're all sort of at it at the same time. We're all perpetrators.
We are perpetrators. We are also perpetrators, as well as we're not just victims. And yes, and also, I was watching it. I had the Coca-Cola plastic bottle in my hand, and I had my car keys, and they're becoming quite hot and heavy in my pocket. But I drove my car, and I came here today driving my car. So here you are, this winter is quite cold, so I had my fossil fuel sort of generated by fossil fuel, maybe energy, by that. So we are all complicit.
Where, if anywhere, somebody, I remember seeing the other day, someone saying, well, psychotherapists should never impose their values on their clients' patients. So where, assuming psychotherapy could be part of something that isn't just part of the problem, which I think it probably is, and stops things happening. But should we be should we be listening to you this evening, or are we listening to you as a way of just ensuring we've heard you and don't do enough, and therefore we do nothing because we've taken it into account? And thank you very much. We are very socially aware.
Socially aware. I mean, that's part of the complicitness. And I think at some point we have to think why we have arrived at the point that we think having more is good for us. That somehow the idea of accumulating and having more is good for us. There was, the whole notion of ascesis, of actually living with less, was actually considered a virtue once upon a time, right? But actually, no, it's been denied. This value is not part of what capitalism advocates, acknowledging limits. Or the whole idea of Diogenes, the skeptic, you know, who lived in a plinth and, you know, just drank water, had one cup, and Alexander the Great visited him and said, wanted to see the great philosopher. He said, could you just move a little bit to the side? You're blocking my sun, right? And of course, that's the irony that, you know, and then Plato came to see him and said, how can you live like that? You're a great philosopher and you live in a plinth and you don't wash and you live with nothing, you know? And look at me, I have all of this and, you know, look, I might be like that and, you know, I might not have a lot, but I don't serve a tyrant. Because Plato was the official philosopher of the tyrant of Syracuse.
Mm. Yes.
Right? So there is something about where did we get the idea that having more and having all of this and being afraid to lose it and thinking that we can't live with less and we can't be enough with living with less and actually being content and satisfied. There is something that is gone terribly wrong, and we've been all sort of feeling that, you know, it's okay to carry on as we are. And of course, this is the denial of limits and finitude.
I think this is. Sorry.
Quick comment, promise. But it's, as you say, I think the three best things in life are free of charge: nature, relationships, meaning. Okay, free of charge. In some sense. Oh, some sense. Sorry, but in some sense, you know, nature's been taken away from you to some degree. Relationships are now valued on who's got this and who's got that.
Social capital. Yeah.
And suddenly meaning, you know, do you feel valued and meaningful in the world if you haven't got something to show? And so it's fascinating to think these things free of charge and absolutely glorious and beautiful and simultaneously have been transformed into, oh, right, so it's not free anymore.
It's not free, no.
So I think there's something about the way that the transformations happened and suddenly people propelled forward, but that's all I was going to say.
Yeah, no, but you're right. I mean, there's, you know, we don't need, actually, we don't need a lot, but, you know, but we have convinced now that we have to build a profile, have social capital, have human capital. Everything is translated into some form of capital. Human capital, have more skills, making you more relevant to the marketplace, being able to sell yourself more, right? Having relationships, which of course, having connections, having people who you can use in order to build your social capital, so as to promote yourself and build a profile that this will be desirable, right? And, you know, and meaning as well, you know, meaning is given to how many likes you get on social media. You know, if you put a nice post there and then you feel satisfied, that, you know, or write something against, you know, a certain policy or right, and then you get, you know, about 300 followers saying how great it is, and then that gives you meaning. And this is another form of metrics and social accumulation, which, you know, accumulation of you know, where value is and meaning is measured by metrics, by likes, by, you know, where everything becomes quantified and capitalized and accumulated. And this is another way. And, you know, on some level, you know, the spell needs to break. And it will break, but unfortunately, you know, it will, you know, for people who will break, sometimes I think that, you know, they won't need certain segments of population. They will become disposable. And they become disposable. This idea of the having the kind of unemployed and the kind of the, on some level, to keep them there in case that we need labor to, well, certain segments of the population will not be necessary anymore. Will just go to waste. I mean, they can die like they did in the Middle Ages. They can just die. You don't need them.
Because the only identity that's worth anything is that of consumer.
Yes. The sell, yes. I mean, the ones who cannot participate in this sort of order, they can just, you know, die. That's what's happening. They will not be visible. They are not already becoming. It's already happening. They will become invisible. They're already invisible. Well, to start with, class is invisible, but that's another story. But you know, the whole thing just becomes invisible. You know, we become invisible, non-entities. Right?
We cannot consume.
Yes, if you don't have. Yes, but you see, money, you know, becomes quite also. Han has this wonderful thing that he thinks of money as something that, you know, in the past was simple. It was symbolic of having the ability to buy sacrificial animals, which will then be sacrificed in order to you know to protect you against being killed, or having the kind of the winning the favor of gods and protecting you against misfortune. So money becomes, you know, this mana that gives you the ability to fend yourself against death, but also be able to give you the power to kill others, you know, because you will be able to protect yourself and others can be killed.
It's not just the power, but it's the obligation.
Yeah.
You have to kill the other.
Yeah.
And that's sort of, I was thinking about the book, The Age of Spectacle by Guy Debord, who talks about all of this. And,
Yes.
you know, that capitalism always pits one against the other. And that, in fact, you know, money, yes, it's used to buy clothes or whatever, but also to survive, you know, and therefore money does take on an absolutely crucial necessity. It's fear. It's fear.
Yes.
It's capitalism.
Absolutely. But, you know, it's also the idea of survival. So is it time to finish?
No, I think Anil wanted to ask.
Yeah.
something.
Survival. No, go ahead, Anil. Yeah.
No, I was trying to come in with something, but I don't know if the time's passed, but it was just the stuff about how nature, relationships and meaning are somehow free of charge. And I kind of think, I don't know about all of that. I think that's all very complicated, actually, it depends on for whom and when and where and all that stuff. But Anastasios, what you're saying I think is really important, because you're saying something about how insidious all of this stuff is, in a way, that the idea of, well, let's say that we're talking about capitalism, but the idea of progress and efficiency, and endless progress and endless efficiency. I want to say that's quite clearly related to psychotherapy, isn't it? And people want to say that there's been no progress. People say that about philosophy. You know, it's been how many thousand years and there's no progress, and somehow it's not efficient enough. But there's not usually enough thought about what the hell are we talking about? What are these two things? It reminds me of two things. There's a quote from Wittgenstein where he says something like, "The thing about progress is that it's not as good as it seems," or something like that. Really bland, but it's really a great quote, I think. And there is something from Heidegger, when Heidegger was being interviewed just before he died. I think you probably know this, Anastasios, but he's been interviewed, I think, by Der Spiegel, and they thought they had him in their crosshairs because they wanted to say that everything he said was pretty much nonsense, and they were saying, look, what's the problem? What's the problem with all this stuff about technology? You know, there are more and more things being built. That, you know, people are being able to spend more. What's the problem with all of that? Everything is functioning. And Heidegger says something like, everything is functioning. That's the problem. That there is a problem.
Exactly.
And I think it's just, well, I think we're talking about this very similar thing, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. And I think there is here the idea that somehow the emphasis on accumulation, but also the emphasis on survival, not on the, you know, life within limits and death, but the emphasis on survival. And survival as what? The two biggest, I think, our current sort of mythological sort of myths of our time started already with the Gothic imaginary, the vampire and Frankenstein.
Right. Undead and the
undead who needs constant, supply from the other in order to carry on living, to survive, right? Consuming, having a constant supply of blood in order to preserve his own sort of undeadness, right? And Frankenstein, the monster that is a technological miracle and defies death and achieves immortality and turns into a monster, and I think there is something here about this as a kind of the Gothic imaginary, and of course the zombies is the latest one, the living dead, right? And I think all of this is the outcome of survival. Survival at what cost? At the cost of actually, becoming a performance zombie, right? Or a vampire that finds only pleasure in consumption, in constant supply. Well, which of course is the definition of narcissistic pathology, right? That sense of, I want constant supply, and if I don't have the supply, I will die. Maybe that's the solution. If we stop the supply, maybe death will come and will stop, but then perhaps some other type of life will emerge. Perhaps the supply needs to be stopped. What if we stop the supply? Maybe we'll come to some sense of how we can live differently without this endless supply of consumption and
with the rats.
One of the things is the whole thing about the endless part. It's not against progress, whatever that is, or against efficiency, but the idea that we can just keep on getting more and more efficient. I think when I was working in the NHS, there's a thing about how we had to get leaner. Each year we had to get leaner and leaner. And after a while you begin to think, well, hang on a minute. I mean, how lean can you get before you get very ill? There's something less and less. It's greater efficiency savings. Anyway.
Yeah. To the extent that, it becomes so self-disruptive and destructive that you can barely survive anyway. But that's another matter.
I love the irony that psychoanalysis brought to my mind that the richest man in the world is responsible for efficiencies in the US government. Good irony to that.
Great.
It's
keeping everything leaner whilst, and who's doing it? The single most greatest accumulation of money
ever. And he's going to fire 2 million sort of US employees.
Yeah.
Kind of shaving away. Yeah. That's exactly, let's make things lean. Let's attack the deep state. Yeah.
But maybe like the death of capitalism is the only way that, when you say something about stopping the supply, and like it feels like the only way to stop something that's so endemic is a cataclysm. There's not a way of dismantling it neatly like it's a machine and it's not really serving us anymore. I mean, it's a negative view of it, but I wonder what the evolutionary, the end of the epoch of capitalism can be, other than its death, and its death being quite a seismic event.
Well, it could be death by suicide, but
Don't hear that at all.
That would possibly be the end. Yes, I think death by suicide, I suppose. Yeah.
There are moments. I think the National Health Service, for example, the idea of it formed after the Second World War.
Yes.
That brought people to different senses for a short while.
Yeah. And they said, what do we want? What do we want? It's like at some point, history becomes, is not a one-way street. Maybe there are, we can arrive at a crossroads and we say, well, we don't want this anymore. But, and I think.
Give up narcissism.
Huh?
You have to give up our own narcissism.
Absolutely. We also become our own, that's the whole thing. We become our own consumers and the supplier at the same time. We be sold to ourselves, right? We be sold to ourselves. So we become our own supply and our own consumption. So we become supply of others and also get the others a supply. So endless consumption and production of selves that were going to be consumed.
Anthropologists and historians who argue that once you introduce something like the NHS, some kind of welfare system, that kind of intersection of trying to cater for society, that's usually the beginning of the end. So they look back at Roman history, and not sure who else to be fair, but usually it marks the beginning of a decline.
Yeah, but also, I think what is my role of a therapist, that I find myself catering for this type of continuous supply myself, right? Where people come to me and trying to restore them so as to become more efficient supplies to this and also more efficient consumers. I'm contributing to this therapeutic capitalism, and and I'm also part of that system, right?
They can beat other people in getting what they want.
Yes.
Through therapy.
Yeah, through therapy.
Yeah,
Right?
more so.
Buying a relationship and actually saying, you are responsible. Maybe you can, if you change this and improve this and do some exercise, do this, build your own sort of profile, go out there, you can sell yourself in the market more efficiently. Right? I mean, we do that. We all do it on some level. We see people suffering and we try to, perhaps, the question is maybe we need to emphasize, well, what will happen if we stay with that suffering without trying to move out? Stay with the pain. Perhaps pain is not pathology. Perhaps pain is not pathology. Yeah?
I think that as therapists we do, I think that a lot of what we do is actually working to dismantle our omnipotence and kind of come to a sort of depressive position, I think. When I think about it in Kleinian terms, I think there's a lot of coming to terms with disappointment and limits, and our own limits in what we can do in the therapy, and just sort of learning to bear that, I think is a big part of our project.
But, the people who come to us, though, they don't want the limits. They don't want the thing. They want, saying, look, I mean, everybody around me is just moving on and they're getting promotions and they're managing their lives. They're getting into relationships. They're good at dating. And I'm here. And look, I don't know what to do. I'm just addicted to this, to that, and I just want to overcome my addiction and actually become successful. And you think, well, let's start with what means for you to be successful, first of all, right? What is the notion of success here? What do we mean by that? And, perhaps there is something about us that we can actually start introducing some social sort of ideas in the therapy without being sort of neutral.
That's the question.
Yeah, without having this type of neutrality.
It's not neutral, right?
Yeah.
Well, the way we're putting in our values.
But the fantasy of neutrality, in a way, that somehow we want. Fantasies, of course.
Can we, if nothing else, thank Anastasios for showing us the limits of our
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, say that the next SAFPAC seminar is on a Saturday. It's Saturday the 22nd of February between 3:30 and 5 o'clock. Again, end of the day one. It's all on Zoom, so there won't be a problem with the telly and what have you. But it's Andrew Feldmar talking about radical psychotherapy. This is a lot of its experience with Lang. It's in a book of his called Credo that came out last year. But he will be talking with us on Saturday, the 22nd of February, 3:30 to 5 o'clock. And everyone welcome. It's on the webpage for those of you who are not in the room here today who wish to come along. So wonderful to see you again, Anastasios.
Oh, it's great. It's great to be here. Thank you, Joe.
Okay.
Thank you.